The sound was the first thing, a soft, rhythmic friction of skin against the cool, polished mahogany of his desk, a stark contrast to the distant, muted hum of New York City traffic 40 floors below. Outside the panoramic window, the city lights blurred into a glittering tapestry, a silent audience to the scene unfolding in the penthouse office of Vance Innovations. Her fingers dug into the fabric of his expensive shirt, knuckles white, a desperate anchor in a rising tide of sensation that threatened to pull her under. A weak protest, a final grasp at propriety, escaped her lips, little more than a breath against his skin. Julian. No, we shouldn't. This is wrong. But the words were stolen, swallowed by the groan that followed as his hips pressed down, stealing her breath and her resolve in a single, deliberate movement. His voice was a low growl in her ear, laced with the power he wielded in the boardroom and the raw desire he saved for these stolen moments after dark. It's too late for that, Maya. The city, his desk, his world. And for now, she was the center of it. The resistance melted from her body, replaced by an arching, undeniable need, and her protest became a different kind of plea, a whispered, breathless, "Oh, Julian, please." Then, as quickly as the storm had crested, it broke, leaving only the sound of two people breathing heavily in the sudden, deafening silence. He pulled away, the loss of his warmth an immediate, chilling shock. The world rushed back in the soft glow of the desk lamp, the weight of their transgression hanging heavy in the air-conditioned stillness. He was Julian Vance, the CEO, effortlessly composing himself, straightening his tie, buttoning his cuffs, the master of his universe once more. And she was Maya Reed, the intern, sitting up slowly, her dress tangled around her waist, a flush of shame creeping up her neck that was hotter than the peak of her pleasure moments before. She avoided his eyes, focusing instead on a meaningless spot on the glass wall, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to smooth out the wrinkles in her clothes, evidence of their feverish encounter. He was a married man, a husband to a woman, whose picture sat elegantly framed on a nearby shelf. And she had a boyfriend, Liam, the kind, steady man who was likely waiting for her text, wondering why she was working so late again. This wasn't the first time the lines had been so thoroughly erased on this very desk, and as the weight of their shared secret settled around them like a shroud, a deep, aching sadness knew, with absolute certainty, that it wouldn't be the last. It didn't begin in the dark, with the city lights as their witness. It began under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights in the main boardroom, a sterile, soulless space on the 40th floor, designed for ruthless decisions and the dissection of ambition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and quiet desperation. Julian Vance sat at the head of a 20-foot-long obsidian table, a king on his throne, flanked by men in suits the color of charcoal and storm clouds, men whose faces were etched with the fatigue of 1,000 such meetings. He was listening, but he wasn't hearing. Mark Renshaw, his senior vice president of marketing, was droning on, presenting a new strategy with all the passion of a man reading a grocery list. It was safe. It was predictable. It was, Julian thought with a deep internal sigh, utterly mediocre. His gaze drifted towards the window, his mind already calculating the logistics of his upcoming trip to Tokyo, when a small sound, a hesitant clearing of a throat, broke the monotony. He turned his head slightly. In the corner of the room, seated in one of the chairs reserved for assistants and note-takers, was an intern. He vaguely recognized her from the sea of young, eager faces that flowed through the company each summer. He hadn't known her name. She had her hand raised just a few inches, a tentative flag of rebellion in this land of silent acquiescence. Mark Renshaw paused, his face clouding with annoyance at the interruption from someone so utterly insignificant. "Yes?" he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. The girl, Maya Reed, Julian would later learn was her name, flinched but did not lower her hand. All eyes in the room, including Julian's, were now fixed on her. The silence was heavy, judgmental. "Mr. Renshaw," she began, her voice a little shaky but clear. "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe the core data you're using for the demographic projection is flawed." A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. An intern was not just speaking, she was challenging a senior VP. It was corporate suicide. Mark laughed, a short, ugly bark. Flawed? Young lady, this data comes from the finest analytics firm in the country. But Julian leaned forward, a subtle movement that instantly silenced Mark's blustering. For the first time in an hour, he was genuinely interested. Explain, Julian commanded. The single word cut through the tension, an order that was not to be disobeyed. He watched her. She was wearing a simple white silk blouse, buttoned almost to the collar, and a plain black skirt. It was the uniform of a young professional trying to be invisible, but on her it failed spectacularly. The severe hairstyle, a dark, glossy ponytail, only served to accentuate the elegant, vulnerable line of her neck and the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. As she began to speak, the initial tremor in her voice vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence that was mesmerizing. She hadn't just found a flaw, she had dissected it, analyzed it, and prepared an alternative model. She spoke of algorithms and predictive behavior with a fluency that made Mark Renshaw's expensive presentation feel like a child's crayon drawing. And as Julian listened, something shifted within him. He stopped hearing her just as an analyst and began seeing her as a woman. He noticed the way a single strand of dark hair had escaped her ponytail and lay against the soft skin of her temple. He watched the subtle, unconscious way she bit her full lower lip when she paused to gather her thoughts, a gesture of concentration that sent a wholly inappropriate jolt of electricity through him. Her hands, which had been clasped nervously in her lap, were now moving, sketching her ideas in the air with a fluid, unconscious grace. There was a fire in her, a passion for the work that he hadn't seen in any of his seasoned executives in years. It was the beautiful, untamed energy of youth, but sharpened to a fine point by a brilliant mind. He found himself tracking the gentle curve of her waist as she leaned forward to point to a figure on the screen, the way the cheap office lighting caught the subtle sheen of her blouse, hinting at the soft form beneath. The air in the room suddenly felt warmer, the space between them charged with a new, unspoken current. He had spent 2 decades building an empire, surrounding himself with the best, the most ruthless, the most experienced. He was married to Eleanor, a woman who was his perfect social and intellectual equal, a partner in the grand enterprise of their life. Their relationship was a well-run corporation of its own, built on mutual respect and shared ambitions, but its passions had been filed away and forgotten years ago. In that moment, watching this young, fierce, brilliant woman, Julian felt the tectonic plates of his carefully constructed world begin to groan. He felt a forgotten, primal, stirring the thrill of discovery, the desire not just to mentor, but to possess. From Maya's perspective, the world had narrowed to the man at the end of the table. When she first dared to speak, her heart had hammered against her ribs, convinced she would be escorted from the building by security. But then Julian had spoken, and his gaze had locked onto hers. It was the most intense scrutiny she had ever experienced. It was more than just the piercing stare of a powerful CEO. It felt as if he were performing an MRI on her soul, seeing every fear, every ambition, every insecurity she possessed. Yet, within that intimidating focus, there was something else. It wasn't just approval, it was appreciation, a deep personal recognition that made her feel more visible, more real than she had ever felt in her life. She was acutely aware of him, of the sheer force of his presence. The way he held his pen, the quiet, immense power in the set of his shoulders, the way his dark eyes seemed to miss nothing. She felt a strange heat spread through her chest, a dizzying cocktail of fear and exhilaration. She was performing for an audience of one, and she knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her that she had captured his complete and undivided attention. When she finished, a profound silence held the room. She had systematically and politely dismantled the entire foundation of a multi-million-dollar campaign. Mark Renshaw's face was a mask of pale fury. Julian remained silent for a long moment, his eyes still locked on hers. Then, he smiled. It was not a broad, friendly smile. It was a small, sharp, predatory curl of the lips. "Mark," he said, without looking away from Maya, "table your proposal. It's clear we have more work to do." He then directed his full attention back to her, the other powerful men in the room effectively dismissed. Miss Reed, that was the single most insightful piece of analysis I've heard this quarter. I want a full, detailed report expanding on your findings. On my desk. By the end of the day, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You will deliver it to me personally, in my office. We will discuss it then. The meeting was over. As the executives filed out, a mixture of shock and grudging respect on their faces, Maya remained in her chair, her legs feeling too weak to stand. She had won. She had proven herself. But as she replayed the final, lingering look in the CEO's eyes, a shiver of a different kind ran down her spine. It was a look of acquisition, a look that promised far more than a corporate mentorship. It was the look of a man who had just seen something he wanted, and Julian Vance always got what he wanted. The spark had been ignited, not in a bedroom, but a boardroom, casting a dangerous, seductive glow on the path that now lay before her. The end of the day came, and Maya, clutching the report like a shield, rode the private elevator to the 40th floor. The journey felt like an ascent into the heavens, or perhaps a descent into somewhere far more complicated. When the doors opened, the bustling office she had left just hours before was transformed. The armies of ambitious young men and women were gone, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The only light came from the far end of the floor, a warm, inviting glow from the open doors of Julian Vance's corner office. He was there, his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up to the forearms, standing by the vast window with a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't seem like a CEO, but like a lonely lighthouse keeper, watching over the sea of glittering city lights. He turned as she approached, and the same small, sharp smile she remembered from the boardroom touched his lips. "Maya," he said, his voice a low murmur that wrapped around her in the quiet space. "Come in. Close the door." That was how it began. Not with a bang, but with the soft, definitive click of a closing door. Their first meeting was, on the surface, entirely professional. He went through her report, page by page, his focus absolute. He challenged her assumptions, pushed her logic, and praised her insights with a precision that was both thrilling and terrifying. But beneath the veneer of corporate strategy, a different language was being spoken. It was in the way he never broke eye contact, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. It was in the way he gestured for her to come closer, to look at a chart on his screen, forcing her to stand beside his chair, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of sandalwood and leather. She was acutely aware of every small detail, of the powerful muscles in his forearm, of the fine, dark hair just visible below his rolled-up sleeve. When the meeting was over, well past 9 o'clock, he simply said, "This is good work, Maya, but it's just the beginning. I'm putting you on a new project, a strategic deep dive. You'll report directly to me." And so, the routine was established. The special project became the perfect excuse, a legitimate reason for the two of them to be sealed away in his glass-walled sanctuary long after the sun had set and the rest of the building had emptied. The late nights became their secret world. For Maya, it was an intoxicating, dizzying education. She was learning more in a week with him than she had in her entire business degree. He was a brilliant, demanding, and surprisingly patient teacher. He unlocked parts of her mind she didn't know existed. She would explain this to Liam, her boyfriend, her voice filled with genuine excitement. "It's an incredible opportunity, babe. I'm basically getting a private MBA from the CEO himself." And Liam, ever supportive, would smile and tell her how proud he was, never seeing the shadow of complication in her eyes, never questioning why these mentorship sessions so often stretched towards midnight. He couldn't understand the pull, the gravitational force of Julian's world. Life with Liam was comfortable, a well-worn sweater. Life in Julian's office was a high-wire act without a net, and she was beginning to crave the adrenaline. For Julian, these sessions were a slow, exquisite torture. He told himself it was about nurturing talent. He told himself he was simply sharpening a brilliant mind, the same way he would sharpen a business strategy. But it was a lie, and he knew it. He found himself manufacturing reasons to keep her later, inventing complexities in the project just to prolong their time together. The work was the excuse, but the true purpose was to simply be in her presence. He became an obsessive student of her. He learned the subtle shift in her expression when she was about to solve a problem. He learned that she hummed, a barely audible, tuneless sound when she was deeply focused on a spreadsheet. He started making them coffee from the expensive machine in his private kitchenette, and the simple act of handing her a warm mug became fraught with tension. His fingers would intentionally brush against hers, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through his system. He would watch her, his heart rate quickening, as she took a sip, her full lips glistening from the steam. One night, they were working at the large whiteboard that covered an entire wall, mapping out a complex market entry plan. She stood in front of it, marker in hand, her back to him. She had her hair down, and the dark, silky curtain of it fell over her shoulders. The scent of her shampoo, something clean and floral, filled the small space between them. "I think the error is here," she said, her voice soft with concentration. He stepped closer, his body just inches from hers, the warmth of her back a magnetic force. "Show me," he whispered, his voice huskier than he intended. He reached around her, his arm brushing against her shoulder, his hand placing itself flat on the board just next to her head, trapping her in his orbit. He saw her posture stiffen, a tiny, almost imperceptible freeze in her movement. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. For a long second, neither of them breathed. The air was thick, with unspoken words, with a desire so palpable it felt like a third person in the room. He could feel the fine hairs on his arm stand on end where he'd touched her. He could smell her perfume, that subtle, intoxicating scent he now associated with a dangerous kind of hope. He held the position for a heartbeat too long before pulling back, retreating behind the safety of a professional comment about her data point, but the spell had been cast. The line between mentor and man, between intern and woman, had been irrevocably blurred. They continued to work, but the silence was now filled with the echo of what had almost happened and the promise of what was still to come. He was no longer just her boss. He was her captor, and she was his willing, mesmerized prisoner, locked in a gilded cage 40 floors above a world that had ceased to matter. The opportunity to cross the line presented itself, as it so often does, under the guise of professional obligation. The project, their project, required a trip to Chicago for a final pitch to a potential acquisition target. The change of scenery was a palpable thing, a subtle loosening of the invisible threads that bound them to their roles in New York. On the plane, seated side by side in first class, he was not quite the untouchable CEO, and she was not quite the deferential intern. They were simply Julian and Maya, two travelers suspended 30,000 feet in the air, a temporary pocket of reality where the old rules felt distant and negotiable. The anonymity of a new city wrapped around them like a cloak. In Chicago, no one knew them. No one was watching. The pitch was a triumph. Maya, armed with the strategies they had honed during their late nights, was nothing short of brilliant. She was poised, articulate, and utterly convincing. Julian watched from the side, feeling a swelling of pride that was dangerously proprietary. He saw the impressed looks on the faces of the other company's board members as they listened to her, and he felt a possessive thrill. She was his discovery. He had shaped this raw talent into something formidable, and her victory felt like his own. The deal was unofficially sealed before they even left the room. Celebration was not just warranted, it was required. He chose a restaurant in a quiet, historic neighborhood, a place with dark wood, dim lighting, and a wine list as thick as a novel. The corner booth he'd reserved offered them an illusion of perfect privacy. The first bottle of wine arrived, a deep, velvety Cabernet, and as it was poured, the last vestiges of their office dynamic dissolved. He raised his glass. "To you, Maya," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You were magnificent today." She blushed, a soft bloom of color that he watched with fascination. "We were magnificent," she corrected, but her eyes were shining with the pleasure of his praise. The wine worked its slow, insidious magic. With the first glass, they performed a meticulous post-mortem of the meeting, their conversation sharp and professional. With the second glass, the topic drifted. He asked about her life, about her ambitions beyond Vance Innovations. He asked about Liam. "He's great," she said, swirling the dark red liquid in her glass, her gaze fixed on the motion. "He's a high school history teacher. He's kind and stable. We've been together since sophomore year of college." The words were all correct, but her tone was flat, reciting a biography rather than describing a passion. Julian noticed she didn't use the word love. He sounds like a good man, Julian offered, a neutral, probing statement. Maya looked up from her glass, and for the first time he saw a crack in her cheerful, ambitious facade. A profound, aching loneliness resided in her eyes. He is, she said softly. But sometimes I feel like I'm living a life we planned when we were 19 years old, and I'm not that person anymore. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, intimate thing. It was the only opening he needed. He took a slow sip of wine, the picture of thoughtful consideration. I understand that feeling, he began, his voice taking on that same confessional tone she had used. Eleanor and I, we are excellent partners. We run our life, our homes, our social calendar with remarkable efficiency. It's a successful merger. He paused, letting the corporate language create a deliberate, chilling effect. But passion doesn't respond well to efficiency. It doesn't show up on a spreadsheet. After a while, you forget what it even feels like. He wasn't just talking to her. He was seeing his own quiet desperation reflected in her young, searching eyes. In that moment, they were not a CEO and an intern separated by 20 years and $1 billion. They were two people admitting, without saying the words, that they were profoundly lonely. The walk back to the hotel was a study in exquisite tension. The cool Chicago air did little to clear their wine-hazed minds. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer needing to be filled with words. It was a silence that hummed with everything that had just been shared, and everything that was about to happen. He was acutely aware of the scent of her perfume mixing with the night air, of the sway of her hips as she walked beside him, of the almost overwhelming urge to reach out and take her hand. The hotel lobby was a vast, empty expanse of marble and hushed light. The elevator ride to the 27th floor was silent, the air thick and electric. When the doors opened to the long, carpeted hallway, the sound of their footsteps seemed impossibly loud. He walked her to her room, a gentlemanly gesture that felt like the final, deliberate move in a chess game that had been playing out for weeks. She stopped at her door, turning to face him. "Well," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Thank you for dinner, Julian." "The pleasure was all mine, Maya," he replied, his voice a low thrum. She fumbled in her purse for the key card, her fingers suddenly clumsy. He watched her, his resolve, which had been eroding all night, finally crumbling to dust. As she raised the card to the lock, he reached out, his hand covering hers, stilling the motion. The contact was a lit fuse. She gasped softly, her wide, dark eyes flying up to meet his. The professional mask was gone. In its place was a raw, undisguised hunger that mirrored the frantic beating of her own heart. He saw fear in her eyes, but he also saw a thrilling, terrifying invitation. "Maya," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse. And then he closed the distance. His other hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft hair at her nape as he tilted her head back. The kiss was not gentle or hesitant. It was a deluge, a desperate, drowning release of all the stolen glances, the accidental touches, the late-night tension. It was the taste of expensive wine and shared loneliness, of ambition and regret, of 1,000 unspoken conversations culminating in this single, irrefutable act. For a moment, she was stiff with shock, and then, with a soft, surrendering sigh, she melted against him. The keycard slipped from her fingers, clattering unheard onto the carpet. Her hands, which had been trapped between their bodies, came up to clutch at his jacket, then wound their way around his neck, pulling him closer. It was a kiss of mutual damnation, and it was the most honest thing either of them had felt in years. Just as suddenly as it began, he broke it off. He pulled back, breathing heavily, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were wide, filled with a dawning horror at what he had done, what they had done. He looked at her parted, swollen lips, then at the closed hotel room door, a stark symbol of the final line they had not yet crossed. A war raged behind his eyes. Then, with a look of profound regret, he stepped back, creating a chasm between them. "Good night, Maya," he said, his voice strained and hoarse. And without another glance, he turned and walked quickly down the silent hallway, his footsteps echoing, leaving her alone with the ghost of his touch on her lips and the certain, chilling knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The flight back from Chicago was an exercise in agonizing restraint. They sat 6 feet apart, a chasm of empty space in the first-class cabin that felt more intimate and charged than any touch. Words were unnecessary, professional courtesies an absurd charade. The memory of the kiss in the hotel hallway was a living entity between them, a silent, pulsing thing that made the air thick and difficult to breathe. For 2 days back in New York, they moved like ghosts in their own lives, avoiding each other's paths, the unspoken energy between them, a coiled serpent waiting to strike. The tension was no longer a gentle hum. It was a high-pitched, unbearable shriek that only they could hear. The breaking point was inevitable. It arrived in Maya's inbox at precisely 4:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, a subject line of just 2 words from Julian Vance, "My office, 7 p.m." The body of the email was a single sentence: "We need to finalize the terms of your future." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and exhilaration. She knew this was no ordinary performance review. The terms of your future. It was a command, an invitation, a challenge. This was the final negotiation, and the contract would not be written on paper. She went home, showered, and stood before her closet for a long time. She consciously bypassed the safe, professional grays and navies. Her hand, as if with a will of its own, reached for the dress. It was the color of a deep, bold red wine, a simple sheath of a dress that clung to every curve, professional enough for an office, but with a neckline that dipped just low enough to be a suggestion, a promise. Underneath, she chose her best lingerie, a set of delicate black lace she had bought on an impulse and never worn. It felt like both armor and a sacrificial offering. As she looked at her reflection, at the determined set of her jaw and the fear shimmering in her eyes, she knew she was not a victim being led to slaughter. She was a willing participant, walking toward a fire she had helped to build, drawn by the beautiful, terrifying warmth of its flames. The 40th floor was silent, as she knew it would be. Their cathedral of secrets was empty, waiting for its congregation of 2. He was not behind his desk. He stood by the massive window, a dark silhouette against the glittering cityscape, his back to her. He didn't turn when she entered, as if he had sensed her arrival. "Did you have a productive day, Maya?" he asked, his voice calm, yet resonating with an undercurrent of something deeply primal. "Yes," she managed to say, her own voice sounding thin and distant. "Good," he said, finally turning to face her. His eyes roamed over her, a slow, deliberate appraisal of the wine-red dress, lingering for a moment on the hint of black lace at her neckline. He approved. "I've been thinking about Chicago, about your performance." He began to walk towards her, slowly, circling his desk. "You're a remarkable asset, Maya, too remarkable for an internship. I'm prepared to offer you a permanent position, a fast track, the kind of career trajectory that takes most people a decade to achieve." He laid the offer before her, a dazzling path paved with gold. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, but the words were just noise. The real negotiation was happening in the space between them, in the intensity of his gaze, in the way he had stopped just a foot in front of her. She could feel the heat coming off his body. "What do you want, Maya?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. The question was not about her career. She started, but she had no answer. He knew the answer before she did. With a quiet, deliberate movement, he reached past her to the control panel on the wall. With a single touch, the electronic blinds began their slow descent, the slats closing one by one, shutting out the judging eyes of the city, plunging the office into a warm, sensual twilight lit only by a single desk lamp. The sound of the motor was the only sound, a soft whir that signified the sealing of their fate. The world was gone. Only this room existed. He turned back to her in the dim light. "Let's stop pretending," he whispered. He raised a hand, his fingers tracing the delicate edge of the lace he had noticed earlier. The touch was feather light, yet it seared her skin. "This is a distraction from your work." His thumb brushed the soft swell of her breast above the fabric, and a choked gasp escaped her lips. "Julian, we can't," she breathed, the final, feeble protest of a war already lost. "Your wife, Liam." The names of their other lives felt like foreign words, ghosts from a world that no longer had any claim on them. He silenced her with a kiss. It was not like the frantic, shocking kiss in Chicago. This was slow, deep, and confident. It was a kiss of ownership, a deliberate exploration of her mouth that left her weak and trembling. He was tasting her surrender. His hands moved from her shoulders down her back, learning the shape of her, until they found the delicate tab of the zipper. "I believe," he murmured against her lips, "this is the final term of our negotiation." He pulled the zipper down slowly, the metallic Z-zip echoing in the profound silence, a sound of finality, of a point of no return. The dress loosened, and with a gentle push from his hands on her shoulders, it slid down her body, pooling at her feet in a puddle of dark red silk. She stood before him in the dim light, clad only in the black lace lingerie, vulnerable and exposed. He stepped back, his eyes devouring her, a low groan of appreciation rumbling in his chest. "God," he breathed. "Perfect." He undid the buttons of his shirt with quick, efficient movements, his eyes never leaving hers. He was shedding his own armor, meeting her in this dangerous new territory. He moved towards her, backing her up slowly until the backs of her legs met the hard edge of the mahogany desk, the altar. He put his hands on her waist, lifting her effortlessly until she was seated on the cool, polished wood. "Maya," he commanded, his voice thick with a desire that had finally been unleashed. "Tell me you want this." And the last of her resistance shattered into a million pieces. A sound, half sob, half moan, tore from her throat as she looked into his dark, hungry eyes. "Yes," she cried, the word a desperate prayer. "Oh, Julian, yes." The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed them finally subsided, leaving a quivering, electric stillness in its wake. In the dim, golden light of the single desk lamp, they lay breathless, tangled together on the cool, unyielding surface of the mahogany desk. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged whisper of their breathing, a stark contrast to the distant, indifferent hum of the city 40 floors below. Julian raised himself on one elbow, his body slick with a fine sheen of sweat, and truly looked at her. The intern, the prodigy, the ambitious young woman had vanished. In her place, sprawled across the symbol of his power and authority, was simply Maya, and she was a revelation. He saw her not as a collection of parts, but as a complete, breathtaking landscape of desire he had only ever dreamed of exploring. His gaze, now slow and reverent, traced the elegant line of her collarbone, the gentle slope of her shoulders, and the soft, pale skin of her stomach, which rose and fell with her every breath. His hand, which had been rough and demanding moments before, was now impossibly gentle. He reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate, blue-veined skin of her inner arm, marveling at its softness. He watched as goosebumps prickled the flesh in the wake of his touch, a silent, beautiful testament to his effect on her. "I knew," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly thing, thick with awe. "In the boardroom, I saw the fire in your mind. But this is something else entirely." His hand moved upwards, cupping her breast. It was perfect, a heavy, soft weight in his palm that seemed made for it. He lowered his head, his lips replacing his hand, and a soft, broken sigh escaped her. He praised her in a low murmur against her skin, a litany of whispered worship. "Your skin. It's like silk." He kissed the hollow of her throat, feeling the frantic pulse of her heart beating against his lips. So soft. His exploration continued, a meticulous, loving anatomy of her form. His hands spanned the narrowness of her waist, his thumbs pressing gently into the soft flesh above her hips. "This curve," he breathed, his hand sweeping down the elegant flare of her hip and the length of her thigh. A masterpiece. He saw the discarded pile of her clothes on the floor, the wine-red dress, and the delicate black lace she had chosen so carefully. He had stripped her of her armor, and now he was mapping the soul she had revealed underneath. Under his worshipful gaze and reverent touch, Maya transformed. The initial shock and vulnerability that had made her tremble began to recede, replaced by a blossoming, intoxicating confidence. His desire for her was a mirror, reflecting a power and a sensuality she never knew she possessed. She was no longer just the recipient of his passion, she was an active participant in its creation. Her sighs deepened, losing their hesitant edge and becoming throaty, open moans of pleasure that urged him on. When his attention returned to her breasts, those two perfectly rounded, snow-white peaks that rose so beautifully from her chest, She arched her back, offering herself to him more fully, a silent plea for more. A quiet strength began to flow through her veins. Her hands, which had been gripping his shoulders in a mixture of passion and desperation, began their own exploration. She tentatively traced the hard, defined muscles of his chest, her fingers playing with the crisp hair there. She was fascinated by the sheer power of him, the corded muscles in his arms, the solid width of his shoulders. He was so different from Liam, whose body was the familiar, comfortable body of a boy she had grown up with. Julian's was the body of a man, a predator, and the thrill of touching him, of claiming a small part of him for herself, was dizzying. Sensing this shift, this rising tide of her own power, he lifted her from the desk. The move was effortless, a testament to the strength he kept hidden beneath his tailored suits. He carried her the few feet to the plush leather sofa that faced the panoramic window, laying her down gently among the cushions. The cold, hard surface of the desk had been for the initial, frantic claiming. The soft, yielding leather was for a deeper, more intimate union. He followed her down, their bodies fitting together, and this time when he kissed her, it was different. It was slow, deep, and searching. They looked into each other's eyes, and in their dark, dilated pupils, they saw only their own reflection, their own shared, bottomless need. The world outside, his wife, her boyfriend, their careers, it had all burned away, leaving only the truth of this moment, in this room. Their lovemaking now was slow, rhythmic, a silent conversation between two bodies that had finally found their native language. There were no more words of resistance. Her pleas were only for him to go deeper, her moans were his name, over and over, a desperate, beautiful prayer. Julian. His own responses were just as raw, her name a constant refrain on his lips. Maya. Oh God, Maya. It was a confirmation, a celebration, the complete and total surrender of two souls who had found in each other a momentary, perfect, and devastating salvation from their own quiet loneliness. As their passion crested for a second time, a slow, rolling wave that washed over them completely, they collapsed together, their bodies entwined, their hearts beating in a frantic, matched rhythm. The anatomy of their desire had been fully charted, every secret coastline and hidden valley explored. And in the profound, sated silence that followed, they lay together, adrift in their shared sin, irrevocably bound by the beautiful, terrible knowledge of each other's bodies. The descent from the 40th floor was a fall from a false heaven. The spell, so potent and all-consuming within the sealed confines of his office, shattered the moment the elevator doors opened into the sterile, brightly lit lobby. The world, with its rules and its consequences, rushed back in. They dressed in a clumsy, awkward silence, the rustle of clothing impossibly loud, the intimacy of moments before replaced by a chasm of unspoken shame. Julian, once again the composed CEO, didn't meet her eye. He simply arranged for his personal driver to take her home, a gesture that was both a courtesy and a cold, clear reassertion of their roles. He was the powerful man who could summon and dismiss. She was the girl being sent back to her life. The ride through the sleeping city was surreal. The first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, and the streets were beginning to stir with the first signs of life. Newspaper trucks made their deliveries, and early workers headed towards the subway. Maya stared out the window of the silent, plush town car, feeling like a ghost observing a world she no longer belonged to. Her body ached with a pleasant soreness, a physical record of the night's events. She could still feel the phantom touch of his hands on her skin, still taste the whiskey on his breath, still smell his expensive cologne, which seemed to have seeped into the very fabric of her dress. She was a walking, breathing vessel of their shared secret, and she felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Her apartment, when she finally slipped inside, felt small and suffocating. It was warm and familiar, filled with the comfortable clutter of her life with Liam, his history textbooks stacked on the coffee table, his favorite worn-out sweater thrown over a chair. And there he was, asleep in their bed, one arm flung over her side, his breathing deep and even. His face, in the soft morning light, was open and peaceful, the face of a man who trusted his world implicitly. The sight of him, so innocent and unaware, was a physical blow. The guilt she had managed to hold at bay came crashing down on her, a cold, sickening wave. He was a good man. He loved her. and she had just shattered the foundation of their life without him even knowing it. She fled to the bathroom, stripping off her clothes. The wine-red dress now felt like a garish costume of her sin, and stepped into a shower so hot it nearly scalded her skin. She scrubbed at herself relentlessly, trying to wash away the scent of Julian, the feel of his body against hers, the memory of her own cries of pleasure. But it was a futile exorcism. The memory was not on her skin, it was inside her, a permanent, indelible part of her now. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel, Liam was stirring. He blinked sleepily at her, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. "Hey, you," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Wow, you must have been working all night. Is everything okay with the project?" His concern, his simple, uncomplicated affection, was a form of torture. He sat up and stretched. "I'll make coffee." A few minutes later, as she stood numbly in the kitchen, he wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, burying his face in her still damp hair. "You smell good," he said. He turned her around to kiss her, and she had to force herself not to recoil. The kiss was soft, familiar, and loving. It felt like a lie, a profanity. The taste of her own deceit was a bitter poison in her mouth. She was a stranger in her own home, an actress playing the part of the devoted girlfriend, while her soul was still 40 floors up, entangled with another man. Miles away, in a sprawling stone mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, a different kind of coldness reigned. Julian walked into a house that was less a home and more a curated museum of his success. The silence here was not peaceful. It was a vast, echoing emptiness. He found his wife, Eleanor, exactly where he knew she would be. In the sun-drenched breakfast room, dressed in a silk robe, her silver blonde hair perfectly styled, reading a financial report on her tablet, she looked up as he entered, her cool blue eyes appraising him. There was no welcome home, no warmth. "You're home late," she stated, a simple observation devoid of any emotional curiosity. "Chicago follow-up," he replied, the lie coming easily. It was unavoidable. She nodded, her attention already returning to the screen. "Don't forget the museum benefit on Friday. Black tie. I had your tuxedo sent for pressing." Their exchange was a transaction, a simple confirmation of schedules and obligations. He looked at this beautiful, intelligent, and impossibly distant woman he had married, and he felt a pang of guilt, not for betraying a passion that had never existed between them, but for breaking a contract, for violating the terms of their well-managed partnership. And yet, a darker thought followed immediately. This cold, sterile perfection was precisely what had driven him into Maya's arms. He had been starving in a palace, and she had offered him a feast. Later, in his own cavernous marble bathroom, as he let the steaming water wash over him, he saw his discarded shirt from the night before lying on the floor. He picked it up, and from the fabric rose the faint, intoxicating scent of Maya's perfume. It was a ghost in his pristine, ordered world, a scent of life, of chaos, of unbridled passion. The memory of her body's eager response, of her unrestrained cries, flooded his senses. The addiction was already beginning to curl its tendrils around his soul. He had tried to tell himself it was a momentary lapse, a simple physical release. But as he stood there, surrounded by the trappings of his perfect life, he knew he was lying. He didn't just want her body. He craved the feeling she gave him, the feeling of being dangerously, exhilaratingly alive. As Maya stood before her own mirror, getting ready for the day, she noticed a small, purplish mark on the pale skin of her hip, a faint bruise left by the pressure of Julian's fingers. It was a secret sign, a brand hidden beneath her professional clothes. It was a mark of shame, and yet, a treacherous part of her felt a jolt of secret, thrilling pride. They both went to work that day, two people carrying the same heavy secret, their lives now irrevocably split into the before and the after. The guilt was a heavy cloak, but underneath it, a new, dangerous hunger had awakened, and it was already demanding to be fed again. The days that followed were a new kind of hell. The guilt, which had at first been a sharp, stabbing pain, dulled into a constant, heavy ache in the pit of the stomach. It was the backdrop to every conversation with Liam, every shared meal, every loving, oblivious touch that now felt like a brand of shame on her skin. But a new feeling, something far more insidious, was growing in its place. An insatiable craving. The world, which had once been vibrant and full of promise, now seemed drained of its color. Her work felt mundane, her relationship a pale imitation of real connection. The only thing that felt real was the memory of that night, a memory so vivid and powerful it blotted out everything else. She was an addict in the first throes of withdrawal, and she saw the same desperate hunger reflected in Julian's eyes during their brief, charged encounters in the office hallways. They spoke in coded, professional emails, but the subtext was a scream of mutual need. The question was no longer if it would happen again, but when. The breaking point came, as she knew it would, from him. A week after their night in his office, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. There were no pleasantries, no excuses, just a set of cool, clear instructions. The Carlisle, Friday, 8 p.m., Suite 2700. The door will be open. It was a summons, an order from a man accustomed to being obeyed, and her body reacted before her mind could even process the morality of it. A hot, shameful thrill coursed through her, a feeling of pure, unadulterated anticipation. The following afternoon, a sleek, discreet box from a famously expensive Madison Avenue boutique was delivered to her apartment. Inside, nestled in layers of black tissue paper, was a whisper of midnight blue silk and black lace, a lingerie set so exquisitely decadent it seemed to have been spun from shadow and sin itself. Tucked inside was a heavy, cream-colored card with a single sentence written in Julian's sharp, decisive handwriting. "Wear this for me." The gift was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It was both a breathtakingly intimate gesture and a stark, undeniable act of ownership. He was not asking, he was telling. He was dressing his fantasy, and she was the doll. A part of her recoiled at the implication, at the feeling of being a purchased commodity. But a much larger, more honest part of her was overwhelmed by a wave of potent, dizzying arousal. To be the object of such a powerful, all-consuming obsession was an addiction in itself. On Friday evening, she lied to Liam, inventing a last-minute work dinner for investors, a lie that slipped from her lips with terrifying ease. She moved through the preparations in a dreamlike state, the entire world outside her mission fading to a dull, insignificant blur. The taxi ride uptown, the impossibly opulent lobby of the Carlisle with its hushed, knowing silence, the silent ascent in the gilded elevator, it all felt fated, inevitable. She walked down the plush, silent corridor to Suite 2700, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As promised, the handle turned. The door was unlocked. The suite was bigger than her entire apartment, a vast expanse of quiet luxury. A wall of windows overlooked the lush darkness of Central Park, the lights of the city forming a glittering necklace at its edge. A bottle of champagne was chilling in a silver bucket, 2 crystal flutes beside it. But he wasn't there. The empty room hummed with anticipation, a stage waiting for its actors. Following her silent instructions, she undressed and slipped into the silk and lace. It felt like a second skin, cool and impossibly soft. She looked at her reflection in a gold-framed, full-length mirror and saw a stranger looking back, a dangerous, sensual woman with dark, knowing eyes. She was no longer Maya Reed, the bright intern. She was his creature, a secret brought to life. She heard a key in the lock and her breath caught in her throat. Julian entered, closing the door softly behind him. He stopped dead when he saw her. The cool, controlled CEO she saw in boardrooms was gone. The man standing before her was stripped of all pretense, his face a raw mask of undisguised hunger. His eyes burned over her, devouring the sight of her and the gift he had chosen. "God," he rasped, the word a prayer. There was no other greeting. In 3 long strides, he crossed the room and his mouth was on hers, a kiss that was not a greeting but a claiming. It was brutal, desperate, a kiss that spoke of a week of starvation. His hands were in her hair, gripping her head as if he were afraid she might vanish. And then, his hands moved down her body, grabbing the delicate, expensive silk he had just gifted her, and with a guttural groan, he ripped the fabric. The sound of tearing silk, a shocking, violent punctuation in the quiet room. It was an act of pure, possessive frenzy. He didn't want the fantasy he had dressed. He wanted the raw, real woman beneath it. This time, there was no slow discovery, no gentle exploration. It was a frantic, desperate collision. He pushed her back onto the enormous, cloud-like bed, their bodies tangling in the high thread count sheets. It was a desperate race to feel, to consume, to obliterate the nagging voices of guilt and consequence. The dialogue was no longer laced with subtext. It was the raw, primal language of need. "Maya," he growled against her neck, "you're driving me insane. You're all I can think about." And her response was not one of surrender, but of equal, desperate demand. "Julian," she cried out, her nails digging into his back. "I need this. Please, I need you. Take me now." Their bodies moved in a frantic, almost violent rhythm, a storm of pure lust raging within the opulent, silent suite, a stark, beautiful contrast to the serene, peaceful darkness of the park outside their window. It was not love. It was a fix, a desperate shared hit of the most potent drug they had ever known. And as their release came, a shattering, simultaneous crest, it was not a feeling of connection, but of pure, selfish, glorious sensation. In the aftermath, as they lay panting in the wreckage of silk and sheets, the quiet that descended was different from the last time. It wasn't filled with awe. It was hollow, the profound, empty silence that follows the peak of a powerful high. The addiction had been fed, but the craving, she was beginning to understand, would only come back stronger. An affair exists in a fragile, hermetically sealed bubble of its own creation. Inside is a world of breathtaking intensity, of heightened senses and stolen moments that feel more real than life itself. Outside is the mundane, predictable world of routine and responsibility. For weeks, Julian and Maya had moved between these two worlds, becoming masters of deception, their lies growing more fluid and confident with each successful transgression. The initial, frantic desperation of their addiction had settled into a steady, consuming rhythm. Twice a week, they would meet, sometimes in the opulent anonymity of a hotel suite, other times in a sleek, private apartment Julian kept in Tribeca for just such business. They had become careless in their confidence, believing their bubble was impenetrable. They were wrong. The first crack appeared on a bright, crisp Tuesday afternoon. They had just spent 3 hours in a boutique hotel in Soho, a place chosen for its discretion. Lunch, they would call it, though no food was ever consumed. It was a long, languid session of lovemaking, a luxurious midday escape from the demands of their lives. They had their routine down to a science. They always arrived and left separately, 5 minutes apart, never making eye contact in public. Julian left first. Maya waited, checking her makeup in her compact mirror, composing her face back into the mask of the diligent, ambitious intern. She walked out of the hotel's discreet side entrance into the bustling street, a sense of smug satisfaction warming her. She hailed a taxi, and as she stepped off the curb, her eyes scanned the crowd. That's when she saw him. David Chen, a quiet, diligent financial analyst from the marketing department, the kind of person who is always overlooked but sees everything. He was walking with a friend, mid-conversation, and his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, but a fraction was all it took. She saw the flicker of recognition, followed by a subtle, confused knitting of his brow. He knew that hotel's reputation. He saw her leaving, alone, in the middle of a workday. Then, just as quickly, his gaze darted away, his face becoming a careful blank as he pretended he hadn't seen her at all. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, but for Maya, time seemed to freeze. A spear of ice-cold dread shot through her. Had he seen Julian leave just moments before? Was he putting the pieces together? She dove into the taxi, her heart hammering against her ribs, the warmth of the afternoon completely gone. The bubble had been pierced. Back at the office, the atmosphere was suffocating. She felt David Chen's presence like a physical weight, imagining his eyes on her back, his hushed whispers in the break room. Every conversation seemed to stop when she approached. Every smile seemed tinged with suspicion. The paranoia was a poison, seeping into her bloodstream, turning the thrill of her secret into a constant gnawing anxiety. The cracks were not just appearing on the outside, they were beginning to fracture her life from within. The small, comfortable apartment she shared with Liam no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like a stage for her constant, exhausting performance. Liam, who had always been her anchor, was now the person she feared the most. He was not a fool. He felt the growing distance between them, a cold, empty space in their bed that had nothing to do with physical proximity. One evening he was cooking pasta, the familiar, comforting smell of garlic and tomatoes filling the kitchen. Maya was curled on the sofa, her back to him, her phone glowing in her hands as she and Julian exchanged a series of increasingly explicit texts. She was so lost in their illicit world that she didn't hear Liam approach. "Find everything you're looking for?" he asked. His voice was gentle, but it held a new, unfamiliar edge. Maya jumped, fumbling the phone and quickly flipping it face down on the cushion. "God, you scared me," she snapped, her reaction far too sharp, far too defensive. "It's just work. This project is killing me." Liam stood there, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his expression a mixture of hurt and weary sadness. "Is it, Maya?" he asked quietly. "Or is it the phone that's killing you? You're here, but you're not. You're a million miles away. When I touch you, you flinch. When I talk to you, I can tell you're just waiting for me to finish so you can look at your screen." He knelt in front of her, his eyes searching hers for a truth she could no longer give him. "Are we okay? Just tell me. Are we okay?" "Of course we are," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She pulled him into a hug, a hollow, desperate gesture of reassurance. But as she held him, her eyes darted back to the dark, silent screen of her phone, her body already craving the next message, the next hit. Liam didn't press further, but as he walked back to the kitchen, she saw the slump in his shoulders. He didn't believe her. And the second crack, a deep, painful fissure, split right through the heart of her home. Julian, meanwhile, believed he was insulated by the sheer scale and complexity of his life. His marriage to Eleanor was a fortress of mutual convenience, not a home built on fragile emotions. But he had underestimated his wife. Eleanor was not an emotional woman, but she was ruthlessly observant. She ran their life with the same analytical precision he ran his company, and she noticed every deviation. They were dressing for the museum benefit, a glittering affair where they would perform their roles as the city's preeminent power couple. Julian was fastening his onyx cufflinks when she spoke, her voice calm and even, her eyes meeting his in the reflection of the vast closet mirror. "You seem distracted lately, Julian." "More than usual." He gave a dismissive shrug. "Just a lot on my mind with the acquisition." "I'm sure," she said, her voice betraying nothing. She turned, adjusting the diamond necklace at her throat. "It's funny, though. I've also noticed you come home some evenings smelling different. Not of your cologne. Something else. Something floral." He froze for a split second, his blood turning to ice. Maya's perfume. It was a light freesia scent he had become addicted to, a scent he often carried home on his clothes, on his skin. He quickly recovered, forcing a light chuckle. "Eleanor, I meet with dozens of people a day. I'm sure I pick up all sorts of things." She didn't respond immediately. She simply met his gaze in the mirror, her own eyes as cool and clear as glass. There was no accusation, no anger, no jealousy. There was only the calm, unwavering stare of a CEO who has just detected a critical market anomaly and is beginning to calculate the potential risk. The lack of emotion was more terrifying than any fight could have been. She knew. She didn't have the details, the name, or the face, but she knew something was fundamentally wrong in the carefully balanced equation of their life. The fortress was not secure. The facade was cracking, and for the first time, Julian felt the chilling fear that the two worlds he had fought so hard to keep separate were about to collide with catastrophic force. The thrill of the affair was still there, but it was now tainted, laced with the bitter taste of constant heart-stopping fear. The slow, agonizing fracturing of a secret is often mistaken for silence, but for the one living inside the lie, it is a deafening roar. Maya had been living with that roar for weeks, the constant, high-pitched frequency of fear and paranoia. She had become so adept at managing the external threats, the watchful eyes at work, the careful choreography of her meetings with Julian that she failed to see the greatest danger was the one who slept beside her every night. She had underestimated Liam's quiet love, mistaking his gentleness for obliviousness, his patience for a lack of perception. She believed the cracks in her facade were invisible, But to the man who had loved her since she was a teenager, they were gaping, seismic wounds. He no longer looked at her with suspicion. He looked at her with a deep, searching sorrow, the look of a man trying to find a person he once knew in the face of a stranger. The end did not come with a scream, but with the quiet click of a mouse. It was a Saturday morning, a gray, drizzly day that matched the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over their apartment. Maya was in the shower, the rush of hot water, a temporary shield from the world, a place where she could pretend just for a moment that she was still the person she used to be. Liam was at their shared laptop, intending to look up movie times, a simple, hopeful act of trying to reclaim a piece of their lost normalcy. Her email was still logged in. He went to sign out, his sense of decency warring with the gnawing suspicion that had become his constant companion. He was not a spy. He was not a jealous man. But he was a man in pain, and he was desperate for an answer. As his cursor hovered over the sign-out button, a new email notification popped up at the top of the screen. The subject line was from a sender he didn't recognize, the Carlisle Hotel, and the title was a single, devastating word, confirmation. His blood ran cold. He told himself it was for work, a business trip, a conference. He clicked on it, his hand trembling slightly. It was a confirmation for a suite. Suite 2700 for the coming Friday night. Billed to a corporate account he didn't recognize. And then, driven by a terrible, self-destructive curiosity, he typed the Carlisle into her email search bar. The results loaded, a neat clinical list of his own personal apocalypse. There were 2 other confirmations, dated over the past month, for the exact same suite. The dates corresponded perfectly with the nights she had claimed to be working late on the strategic deep dive, the nights he had waited up for her, keeping her dinner warm, only to have her stumble in after midnight, smelling faintly of wine and a perfume that wasn't her own. The proof was not just a smoking gun, it was a cold, detailed autopsy of their relationship. He felt no anger, no rage, just a profound, hollow emptiness, as if the entire floor of his world had just given way, dropping him into a bottomless, silent freefall. He closed the laptop. He sat on the edge of their sofa, the place where they had watched countless movies, where he had held her when she was sick, and he waited. The sound of the shower stopped. A few minutes later, she walked into the living room, wrapped in a fluffy white towel, her dark hair slicked back, her face scrubbed clean. She looked young and innocent, and the contrast with the cold, hard facts on the screen was a new, special kind of cruelty. She smiled at him, a tentative, hopeful smile. "Hey, I was thinking maybe we could go see a movie tonight." He didn't smile back. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "How was it?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm, unnaturally flat. She frowned, confused. "How was what?" "The Carlisle," he said, the name of the hotel falling like a stone into the quiet room. "Last month. Suite 2700. Was it nice? Does it have a good view of the park?" The color drained from Maya's face. The cheerful domestic scene shattered into a million pieces. She saw the open laptop on the coffee table, and she knew. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. "Liam, what are you talking about? That's for work." "The company. Sometimes they book rooms for us to..." The lie died on her lips, a pathetic, flimsy thing in the face of the dead certainty in his eyes. He didn't even have the energy to be angry at her lie. He just looked tired, defeated. "Please don't," he whispered, and the plea in his voice was more devastating than any shout. "Please just, don't lie to me anymore, Maya." He finally looked at her, and the raw, naked pain in his eyes was so profound it felt like a physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. "Who is he?" he asked, the question soft, but unbearably heavy. "How long has this been going on? All those late nights, all those texts you hide from me. Was it him?" He stood up and began to pace the small room, not in anger but in agony, as if piecing together the timeline of his own betrayal. "My birthday, Maya, 2 months ago. You said you had to pull an all-nighter to get a presentation ready. You missed the dinner my parents made for me, were you? Were you with him then?" The memory, so specific and so painful, broke through her defenses. The sheer scale of her deceit, of her cruelty, crashed down on her. A sob, thick and guttural, tore from her throat. The denial was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of her guilt. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. "Yes," she choked out, the single word, a confession to everything. "Yes." Liam stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, his back to her. The yes hung in the air, a final, irrevocable verdict. He had perhaps been holding on to a sliver of hope, a desperate belief that there was some other explanation. Her confession extinguished it completely. He was silent for a long, long time. When he finally turned around, the love was gone from his eyes. The trust, the shared history, the easy intimacy of their years together, it had all been wiped away, leaving behind the flat, empty gaze of a stranger. He looked at her, this weeping woman on the floor of the home they had built, and he felt nothing but a vast, desolate emptiness. "I think you should pack a bag," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. I can't look at you right now." The words were not a request. They were a quiet, final judgment. Numbly, mechanically, Maya stumbled to their bedroom and pulled an overnight bag from the closet. She moved like an automaton, grabbing clothes at random, her vision blurred by a constant, streaming river of tears. The silence in the apartment was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shroud. He didn't help her. He didn't stop her. He just stood at the living room window, staring down at the gray, rain-slicked street, his reflection a pale, ghostly image in the glass. When she was finally standing at the door, bag in hand, she whispered his name, one last, desperate plea. "Liam." He didn't turn around. "Goodbye, Maya," he said to the window pane, and the finality in his voice closed the door on their life forever. The hours after Liam closed the door on their life together were a blur of numb, disjointed moments. Maya found herself in a sterile, anonymous hotel room somewhere in Midtown, the kind of place with no past and no future, a perfect purgatory for a soul in limbo. The grief for Liam was a vast, suffocating ocean, and she was drowning in it. But beneath the waves of sorrow was a current of pure, undiluted terror. She had made a wager, betting her entire world, her love, her home, her future on a single, intoxicating feeling. And now, with her old life in ashes, she had to know if she had won anything at all. There was only one person in the world who could give her an answer. Clinging to the wreckage, she did the only thing she could think to do. She went to the source of the fire. Her journey back to the Vance Innovations Tower was a somber pilgrimage. The city lights, which had once seemed like a glittering promise, now felt cold and indifferent. She was no longer the sharp, ambitious intern on a mission. She was a refugee, carrying a small overnight bag that contained the entire, pathetic sum of her new life. The night security guard in the lobby, a man who had seen her coming and going at all hours with Julian, gave her a knowing, almost pitying look as he buzzed her up to the 40th floor. The private elevator ascended in a heavy, damning silence. When the doors opened, she saw him. He was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a solitary king surveying his kingdom. He turned, and the surprise on his face when he saw her disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from hours of crying, quickly morphed into a look of grim understanding. He saw the bag in her hand, and he knew. The consequence he had managed to keep at a comfortable distance had just arrived on his doorstep. Words were useless. She dropped her bag and simply walked into his arms, collapsing against his chest in a storm of broken, ragged sobs. All the grief, all the fear, all the desperate, terrible loneliness poured out of her. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring soothing, meaningless words. He was her creator and her destroyer, the cause of her pain, and, she desperately prayed, her only possible salvation. He led her to the sofa, and his comfort soon turned into something else. Her raw, unfiltered desperation was a powerful, dark aphrodisiac, a validation of the intoxicating effect he had on her. And she, in her brokenness, craved the one thing that had led her to this point. She needed the oblivion of his touch, the momentary, searing pleasure that was the only thing powerful enough to burn away the pain. Their final encounter was not like the others. The fire was still there, but it burned with a different fuel. It was not the exhilarating flame of transgression or the hot, consuming fire of addiction. This was the desperate, frantic burning of a fire, consuming the last of its oxygen. It was a collision of her grief and his power. She clung to him as if he were a life raft in the ocean of her sorrow, her kisses wet with tears, her body moving with a frantic, pleading energy. For him, it was the taking of something that was now, he believed, utterly his. He had broken her, and now he was possessing the pieces. It was a sad, joyless act, a physical motion trying desperately to answer a spiritual question. It was an attempt to feel something profound, but the act itself felt hollow, a ghost of the passion that had once consumed them. It was the last, sputtering gasp of a dying flame. In the aftermath, they lay tangled on the soft leather, the city lights their silent, uncaring witnesses. The quiet that descended was not the sated, intimate peace of their earlier encounters. It was a cold, awkward void. The physical act had provided a momentary release, but it had solved nothing. The grief and fear came rushing back into the emptiness, more potent than before. A single hot tear traced a path down Maya's temple and into her hair. The illusion was fading, and she was terrified of what she would see when it was gone. She broke the silence, her voice a raw, trembling whisper. "He knows. Liam. He kicked me out." She said the words to give them weight, to make them real in this room that had always felt like a fantasy. Julian was quiet for a moment. He gently disentangled himself from her, sitting up and creating a space between them. The CEO was returning, the lover receding. "I'm sorry to hear that, Maya," he said, his voice laced with a cool, detached sympathy that chilled her to the bone. She sat up too, clutching a cushion to her chest like a shield. She needed more. She needed the loss of Liam, the ruin of her life, to have a purpose, a meaning. "Julian," she said, her voice pleading, desperate. "What are we? What is this?" He stood up and walked to the bar, turning his back on her as he poured himself another drink. The gesture was a deliberate severing of their connection. "What we have," he began, his voice calm and measured, as if he were dictating a memo, "has been a remarkable thing, an escape, a source of incredible passion for both of us." He used the past tense. The word echoed in the silent room. She shook her head, not wanting to understand. "No, it's more than that," she insisted, her voice rising. "For me, Julian, I lost everything for this. For you." He turned around, his face unreadable, holding the whiskey glass. He looked at her, this broken, weeping girl on his sofa, and his expression held no malice, no anger, only a profound, soul-crushing pragmatism. "Maya," he said, his voice softening into a tone of gentle, paternal correction. "You are the most brilliant, promising young woman I have ever had in this company. You are a star." He took a sip of his drink. "Don't ever confuse a personal indiscretion with a professional investment. I have invested a great deal in your career, and I expect a significant return." And there it was, the final brutal truth. He wasn't a monster, he was simply a CEO. She was not the love of his life, she was a high-performing asset. Their affair was not a grand passion, it was a personal indiscretion, a temporary, exhilarating merger that had now run its course. The investment he spoke of was not in their future together, but in her future as his employee. Her sacrifice, the life she had burned to the ground, was merely collateral damage in his pursuit of a momentary thrill. The realization did not come with a scream, but with a profound, terrifying silence. The roar of fear and grief in her mind went quiet, replaced by the cold, clear understanding of her own foolishness. The affair wasn't over because Liam had found out. It was over because it had never really been what she thought it was. It was a dangerous negotiation she had entered without ever understanding the terms of the contract. She had lost everything, and he had lost absolutely nothing. She sat there on the sofa in his vast, empty office, the city lights glittering outside, and for the first time she understood the true meaning of being alone. In the cold, sterile aftermath of that final, brutal revelation, the affair was cauterized. There was no lingering farewell, no tearful goodbye. The transaction was complete, and Julian Vance, ever the pragmatist, moved immediately to liquidate the asset and mitigate his risk. The next morning, a formal offer letter was messengered to Maya's soulless hotel room. It was a masterpiece of corporate strategy. She was being offered the position of Director of West Coast Operations, a title that came with a staggering salary, a generous relocation package, and complete autonomy over a new burgeoning division. It was the kind of career-defining opportunity that ambitious young people like her would kill for. It was a golden cage, polished to a brilliant, blinding sheen. He presented it to her over the phone, his voice once again the calm, commanding tone of a CEO, devoid of any memory of their shared history. "This is the return on the investment I spoke of, Maya," he said, his voice cool and clinical. "You've earned it. San Francisco will be a new start for you, a place where your talent can truly flourish." He didn't need to say the rest. A place where she would be 3,000 miles away from his wife, his life, his world. A clean break. She accepted. What other choice did she have? To refuse would be to admit that it was never about her career, a truth she could not bear to face. To refuse would be to step out into a world where she had nothing, no job, no home, no love. And so she took the cage. She signed the papers, packed her bags, and left New York, the city that had built her up and then burned her to the ground. Their final communication was an email from his executive assistant confirming the logistics of her move. He never spoke to her again. A year later, Maya Reed was, by every external metric, a staggering success. She had a corner office in a glittering San Francisco skyscraper with a panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge. She wore designer clothes, drove an expensive car, and commanded a team of people who both respected and feared her sharp, relentless intellect. She had become a perfect, polished reflection of the man who had taught her everything. But her success was a hollow thing, a beautiful, empty cathedral. Her stunning apartment, with its minimalist furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, felt less like a home and more like an elegant, well-appointed prison. She would stand by those windows at night, a glass of wine in her hand, and look out at the fog rolling over the bay, feeling a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. She had tried to date, but something inside her was broken. She could no longer see a kind gesture without searching for the motive behind it. An offer to buy her dinner felt like the opening of a negotiation. A compliment felt like an assessment of her value. The easy, unthinking trust she had once possessed had been surgically removed, and she didn't know how to grow it back. It wasn't Julian she missed. The memory of him was a scar, a reminder of a fever that had almost killed her. The ghost that truly haunted her was Liam's. She would see a couple laughing in a park, their heads bent close together, sharing some small, secret joy, and a wave of grief would hit her so hard it would take her breath away. She had traded that simple, honest warmth for the scorching, temporary heat of a bonfire. And now, all that was left was the cold, gray ash. She had gotten everything she thought she wanted, only to realize she had sacrificed the only thing she ever truly needed. Back in New York, nothing in Julian Vance's life had changed. His company's stock was at an all-time high. His marriage to Eleanor continued its placid, predictable orbit. He was still a king in his castle, a titan of industry, a man who had everything. He had successfully excised Maya from his life with surgical precision, a brief, volatile affair that was now nothing more than a closed file. He had gotten away with it. But some nights, long after the last of his employees had gone home, he would stand in his penthouse office, in the exact spot where it had all begun, and stare down at the city lights. The thrill was gone. The affair had been a potent, life-altering drug, and he had been sober for a year. The world, which had briefly blazed with color and intensity, had returned to its familiar, muted shades of gray. He would pour himself a whiskey and remember the feeling, the intoxicating, heart-stopping feeling of risk, of unbridled passion, of being truly, terrifyingly alive. He looked at his perfect life, a monument to his own ambition, and for the first time, he understood that it was a magnificent tomb. He had won the game, but in doing so, he had lost the capacity to feel anything at all. And so they remained, 3,000 miles apart, two architects of their own private tragedies. She, in her golden cage on the coast, haunted by the ghost of a simple love she had destroyed. He, in his empty palace in the sky, haunted by the ghost of a feeling he could never recapture. There was no grand lesson, no neat resolution. There was only the quiet, lingering echo of a dangerous negotiation, a bargain made in the dark where both parties, in the end, had lost far more than they had ever hoped to gain.